right. So I'm sharing my screen now. Unfortunately, we were doing some trial and error right before everyone joined, and we will have to do this within the PowerPoint program format because slideshow isn't working. I do have some map slides that have small print, so forgive me if you can't read them. I hope you're joining on a larger screen today. So as Samantha introduced me, I'm Andrea Ramhorst. I am the archaeologist for the Wells Field office on the BLM Elko District. So that green dot up there in northeastern Nevada points out the Wells Field office. The BLM Elko District does comprise all of Elko County, and then the Wells Field office is the eastern approximately 5 million acres of BLM land. So I help manage those acres for cultural resources. And northeastern Nevada is contained within the Great Basin, which means that all of our mountain watersheds in the Great Basin either stay in our valleys, go underground, or evaporate. So there are no outlets to oceans. And so you'll notice these north-south trending mountain ranges. So really our part of the Great Basin here in the Wells Field office is a lot of little basins. So the topic of this talk, I'm very excited to share this topic with you. This was inspired by the need to add more sites on the Wells Field office to the Site Stewardship Program. And because a lot of the prehistoric site types on the Wells Field office are sensitive to tribes, they didn't necessarily want the public going out to monitor these site types. So these sites to be added to the Site Stewardship Program had to be historic. And I've noticed over the last few years, there are a lot of interesting historic railroad sites in the area, and that the history along with historic archaeology really helps enrich our understanding of railroad history in general at the end of the 19th century going into the 20th century. And of course, this sort of culminates with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So in terms of the sites that I'll be discussing today, I will be discussing sites that are on BLM land, and like I said, will be added to the Site Stewardship Program. A few are on BLM land and are not recorded, so I need to actually go out and record these sites before adding them to the program. I'm hoping to do that this summer. And I'm also going to talk about a few sites in the Elko area that are on private land, so they're not able to be visited by site stewards, but I thought they were still really interesting and relevant to the topic, so still worth mentioning. So a little bit on the format of the talk. So first I'm going to go over some general railroad history to give us all a broader context for the Transcontinental Railroad and what came through the area. And then I'm going to focus on those individual historic sites. And then I'll wrap up with a summary of how integral the railroad was in supporting many industries in this region at the turn of the last century. So this is a historic map from 1870, and it's from the Central Pacific Railroad Company. So as you can see, the Central Pacific Railroad going from California through Nevada, and the Union Pacific Railroad further east. So when you start talking about the Transcontinental Railroad, you really do have to go back all the way to the 1850s. So this is when there was a lot of buzz about building a transcontinental railroad. It was definitely something that was needed for Western expansion. The big questions were which railroad company is going to build one first and where is the route going to be? So there were three main proposed corridors for the Transcontinental Railroad. There was a northern route that would go through Chicago, and a central route, of course, and a southern route. So with the start of the Civil War, of course, and the Confederacy seceding from the Union, the southern route was out. And from there, it was pretty natural for the central route to be the one to succeed. There was already a lot of infrastructure in California, as you can see on the map. And there was quite a bit of infrastructure all the way west to Iowa, in the eastern states. So in 1862, the northern states passed the Pacific Railroad Act, and this is what allowed the Central Pacific to build east from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific built west from Iowa. So the Central Pacific had a few hard years getting through the Sierra Nevada range. The granite was so hard that they could only get through about 10 inches of rock per day at times. And they did encounter a fair amount of snow as well. And so on the picture at the right shows you a steam engine snowplow. And the Transcontinental Railroad was largely built by Chinese laborers because it was cheaper to bring Chinese workers from China than to have Americans come east by wagon. And, this in itself really shows the need for the railroad because with the Transcontinental Railroad, it was going to be a lot cheaper, faster, and safer to transport goods and people along this railroad line versus by wagon. Another point with the Chinese laborers, it is definitely known that they were not generally treated well. They often did have the most dangerous jobs in building railroad grade, like using black powder and even nitroglycerin to blow through rock for tunnel. But I did find a really interesting detail about the Chinese food rations. And I thought that the food rations were actually a lot better than the American rations. While Americans got beef, bread, butter, and potatoes, Chinese workers got dried oysters, mushrooms, 5 kinds of vegetables, pork, chicken, noodles, rice, salted cabbage, dried seaweed, sweet rice crackers, sugar, 4 kinds of dried fruit, Chinese bacon, peanut oil, and tea. So I'd much rather eat that. And so this picture on the left shows a Chinese laborer carrying tea, and he's actually carrying tea in reused powder kegs. So again, after a hard, slow time in the Sierras, building the railroad through Nevada was much quicker, and the Central Pacific eventually did meet the Union Pacific at Promontory Summit in 1869, where the Golden Spike was driven, finishing the Transcontinental Railroad officially. It wasn't as straightforward as the 2 lines meeting perfectly at Promontory Summit in Utah, but I'm going to get more into this later. Another thing that I do want to point out as I'm talking about these different railroad lines is that the Central Pacific did eventually merge into the Southern Pacific Railroad Company in the 1880s. So there's this continued shuffling of ownership and merging and splitting of these railroad companies as businessmen buy up lines and later sell their shares and things like that. So it's definitely a complex history. In terms of the Central Pacific, that line actually existed until 1969 and then merged into the Southern Pacific. And then the Union Pacific bought the Southern Pacific in about 1995. So as it turns out, the railroad line that we know as the Transcontinental Railroad from Sacramento to Salt Lake, which used to be the Central Pacific, is the Union Pacific today. So just to give you guys a heads up that when I'm discussing these railroad towns, I will go from talking about the Central Pacific earlier on in their history to the Southern Pacific later in the history of these towns, especially in that 1880s timeframe. So this map is showing the Central Pacific route in 1870. And here I have highlighted 3 of the railroad towns that I'm going to be talking about in this talk. Tacoma to the northeast, Tawano, and Pequot. This is a GLO survey map from 1881 showing the location of Tacoma and some of the buildings that were included in that survey. So Tacoma was established by the Central Pacific Railroad in 1869. And at Tacoma, a town formed with a post office, hotel, restaurant, 2 saloons. We were talking about Tacoma. So in addition to being a railroad siding, Tacoma had the added benefit of being a major rail stop for mining in the area. So local mines produced $40,000 over 5 years from 1907. Mm-hmm. And in today's money, that figures to about $1.5 million located once the Southern Pacific once the Central Pacific merged into the Southern Pacific. So the station got moved actually to Wells, or sorry, not Wells, Montello, excuse me. Yeah, so Montello, just to the south of Tacoma, became the main station in the area. So we can definitely observe this trend of boom and bust with these small rural railroad towns. And this is something that we'll see over and over again. So next slide. Okay. Tacoma is on private with private land in white and public land, which is BLM, in yellow. So this is a land ownership pattern called checkerboarding. And if you're not familiar with checkerboarding, this came about from the railroads getting land grants for every other section along a railroad corridor. So this was a government subsidy to the railroads, and this is partly because the government didn't have $2 billion up front in modern money that it would take to pay for the whole railroad, and partly because the government believed that the land value along the railroad corridor would increase over time. And so yeah, unfortunately, Elko internet is pretty notorious. I apologize. If you're local, you know.
So we've had some other questions. There's lots of stories about bandits and robbing stagecoaches along the road between Kilton and Boise gold mines. Then there's bandits. Then the bandits would hide out in the City of Rocks. Was there similar activity in Elko County?
Oh, Yeah, I've definitely heard some of those stories. The City of Rocks one, yeah. I I can't recall any specific stories from the Elko area, but I do know that in Ruby Valley, just directly next to the Ruby Mountains, a little bit south of the mountains. Well, it served as a fort, like a Civil War military fort, and the fort was basically posted there to protect stagecoaches.
Somebody asked, the Chinese built underground community dwelling and a passage through the governor's mansion. Have you heard anything about that?
Do they say where this is?
I don't know. They don't. They were just giving a fact, I think.
Yeah, very interesting.
Do you know any other stories about the Chinese in the railroad?
Well, I do know that after the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, a lot of them actually went to go find work along the Pacific Northwest coast. But yeah, in various kinds of work. That's sort of interesting because there's like a little bit of a vacuum after they get done with this huge job.
Jim Marsh showed us that about 3 years ago in downtown Elko. Okay, about the Chinese mansion, the Chinese underground community dwelling. And the passage to the governor's mansion was in downtown Elko.
Oh, very interesting. I have not heard of that. One other little tidbit about the railroad workers is that, some of them did live in these section houses along the railroad, but the majority of them, as the work was being done, lived in, I think they called them construction trains. So it was like an entire series of train cars that was for the railroad workers to live. And so they had kitchens and sleeping quarters and all of that stuff. So, and then they would stop and then sort of camp. They would have like separate tents that they would set up along the construction trains.
So one of the next question is, can you tell us the story of the connection lines of railroad?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So yes. Well, the Railroad Act of 1862 mandated that the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific would meet somewhere, but they didn't actually specify a meeting point. So the railroad lines just passed each other by about 100 miles each. And this was partially because they were getting paid by the mile, so it was beneficial to them to keep going, but they also didn't apparently do a good job of coordinating where they were going to meet. Yeah, after they passed each other, I'm not quite sure how they became like reorganized again, but then they decided, okay, we're going to do it at Promontory Summit and officially drive the Golden Spike for the official finishing of the Transcontinental Railroad. So that's how that went.
All right, so you have a question. The map of Tacoma, the first one you showed, is fascinating. Can you tell us the source of the map?
Oh, yeah, so that map is, that's all public domain. So it's a GLO map. GLO stands for General Lands Office. So these are surveys that were done when the General Lands Office was surveying. They were essentially doing surveys out west for the Homesteading Act, essentially, because people needed to know where their land claims were going to be. And so this is the whole, motivation for organizing the land with township, range, and section. So on these GLO maps, they would often put historic buildings as well. So they just happen, the surveyors just happen to include those town buildings in Tacoma. I think possibly I'm just going to have to finish this presentation by just talking.
That's fine. I think everybody will do that. We do have another question if you like.
Okay.
They only graded the railroad beds past each other. The last several miles of rails were laid after the meeting location on Promontory Summit was set. So they only graded the rails. They didn't actually lay it until after the meeting was set.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I think, yeah, maybe the best way to do it is just to keep going.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. And I will try to be as descriptive as I can. Okay, so we were talking about Tacoma. All right, and then we went through the checkerboarding. And I told you about the checkerboarding. Okay.
And you guys can see the checkerboarding if you go and look online at any sort of land ownership map. It's pretty interesting.
It really is. And it's very obvious that, oh yeah, it's right along the railroad. Okay, so we'll keep going, everybody. All right. So in terms of what remains at Tacoma, it's not really known to archaeologists which buildings survive. So it was recorded by archaeologists in 1977, and several cement foundations were found potentially associated with the hotel and the store. And then one of the stone foundations, possibly from a section house, was found. But there hasn't been, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a lot of really delving into, are these like, which buildings are they that are in like the GLO survey maps. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talk about Tawano. And you know what, something I can actually do, well, let's see. So just continuing on, in our discussion of Tawano, I would need to talk about how a railroad is separated into divisions. And this is really a management tool. So each division had its own personnel and had its own maintenance. And so these railroad divisions really made these long railroad lines a lot more manageable. And Tawano is one of these division points. So it's located at the end of a division. And at these division points, they have more facilities than other railroad stops. So there would have been maintenance facilities, living quarters, things like that, storage for rail cars. And the name Tawano is actually a Shoshone word that means black-topped, and it refers to the dark-colored trees that top the nearby Tawano mountains. So eventually a town formed at Tawano, it became a major freight center in Elko County, and it even surpassed Elko itself in terms of freight traffic, even though at its height, it only had a population of 117. So by 1870, Toronto had a population of 117 people. It had a post office, 2 hotels, 4 saloons, and a blacksmith. In 1874, it was big enough to open a school, which is not necessarily saying much because this is the era of the one-room schoolhouse. But again, we see this boom and bust. So by 1880, the freight market was largely declining because of competition from other railroad lines. The town of Toronto did hang on for a little bit longer by moving camps of miners to and from mines in the area, and also serving ranches in the area. Eventually, once the line actually became the Southern Pacific, talking about one of those changeovers, the Southern Pacific moved the division point to Wells, then called Humboldt Wells. And most of the population of Toronto did follow that move to Wells. And by 1906, the town of Toronto was completely deserted. At Toronto, there was a roundhouse for train cars. You can't see it in Google Earth anymore, although people have looked. And there aren't any apparent ruins of the roundhouse on the ground, I don't think, if you go out and visit it. At this point, I was going to show you a picture of a different roundhouse that you can see from Google Earth. And if I'm able to send my slides to Samantha, I will show you that in a little bit. So one of the sites that I will be hopefully adding to the site stewardship program is the Toronto Cemetery. So it is not on private land, it's on BLM. It's above the town, up on a hill. It dates from about the 1860s to 1904. And as early as the 1970s, archaeologists were getting reports of degradation from erosion, cattle trampling, and vandalism. An exclosure fence was added to the cemetery. A little interesting tidbit, to my knowledge, I didn't look too far into this, but none of us archaeologists have this information at the office. I think it would be interesting to look into the family names in the cemetery. And also, I believe the site form hasn't been updated since the 70s. So that is something that I would like to update as well. So this is a photo of one of the graves at the Toronto Cemetery. Oh, no, my screen just changed. Okay, so now you should actually be seeing one of those GLO survey maps of Toronto, and I'm zooming in on it. And so you can see where the survey has marked the train depot and a roundhouse. And then the cemetery is up here somewhere on the hill.
Unfortunately, your internet is not showing us anything. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm just gonna stop sharing and keep talking then. Oh, okay. All right. So, okay, the next town that I'm covering is Moore. And so I had a sort of a joke slide that just shows the freeway exit for Moore on the I-80, because that's kind of that's the extent of what most people know as Moore. But it really was a substantial railroad town at one time. And so the town of Moore, it was established in 1869 by the Central Pacific, and it served as a town for woodcutting crews that would be cutting rail ties to build the Central Pacific Railroad track. And so it was pretty primitive. The town, in its early history consisted of simple rail tie houses and a store. Once the railroad was finished, the wood crew moved on, presumably to other work on the railroad, and Moore adapted and became a telegraph station, and also a siding for the Southern Pacific Railroad. There was some mining activity in the area around the 1870s and the 1880s, but the mines didn't produce much, so this was short-lived. I'm just putting the names of the little towns. Okay, so this one is Moore. I just put in the chat. So I found an interesting memoir by Frank Wendell Call, and he has a really rich description of what it's like to live in Moore. So his father, Frank Elwood Call, was a salesman from Ogden, Utah, and decided to actually uproot his family from a comfortable life in Ogden because he wanted to work as a track laborer with the goal of becoming a foreman, which he eventually did. So I found this interesting detail that made me laugh in this memoir. Frank, the little boy, is talking about when they first arrived in Moore, and he says, Father promised a forest of trees where we were going to live. When we all arrived in Moore, the tall trees that we imagined were stunted juniper and pinyon trees, and when they saw their house, they stopped and stared. Built of railroad ties and with a dirt roof, it looked more like a chicken coop than a place for people to live. It didn't look much better when we got inside. There were just two rooms. The west room had a closet and a pot-bellied heating stove. The east room had a place for a range and a shelf big enough to hold a water bucket and dishpan. He goes on to write, house lights and fuel were furnished by the railroad. Housing was primitive. Kerosene lamps were the only source of light. Fuel consisted of old railroad ties and coal, and the railroad was stingy with the coal. After all, the railroad had to buy it and ship it and received no profit from it. The first Monday after we moved to Moore, my brothers and I were introduced to the one-room school. The school comprised a teacher and 7 students. And the 7 students included him and his 2 brothers. So that's pretty telling of how small Moore was. None of the buildings in Moore remain. Quite often with railroads, they would recycle railroad ties for future projects, for trestles, rail tie houses, things like that. So they probably would have done that with the rail tie houses in Moore, but I'm not sure. So in 2021, I did get to visit the site of Moore, and there are historic remains on private land, but there are large portions of Moore that are on BLM and they're not currently recorded. So I would like to get the portion of Moore that's on BLM land recorded and add it to the Site Stewardship Program because it is quite close to the highway. The next town that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to put it in the chat, is Pequot. So the railroad, technically it's not a town, it's a siding. So it would have served the purpose of housing a few railroad workers, but not too much beyond that. We don't have records of, like stores or any other like substantial like post office or anything like that. So the siding site is on BLM land, but the historic site has never been reported. So I did visit the site in 2021, and there are remnants of at least 2 section houses at the site today. And there's also a large historic artifact scatter that confirms essentially that railroad workers were living here. So we find ceramic dishes, stove parts, things like that, that point to residents. And there was also a telegraph line here as well. We found telegraph line wire and squared off telegraph poles, and also telegraph insulators that of course were used to ground the electricity. Yeah. And so I was going to show everybody a picture of a historic artifact pile that I saw when I was there. So there were a lot of insulators in a pile with other historic artifacts, and they were clearly put there by site visitors. And this is something that I see all the time, and I just wanted to bring this to everybody's attention. People will gather artifacts from around a site and put them up on a rock or a place that's in plain view, presumably so that others, when they visit, can see them and enjoy them. But this is definitely a misplaced courtesy. As a lot of you know who are archaeological adjacent on this call, doing this does ruin the context of those artifacts and the overall spatial understanding of that site. So please don't do this when you visit sites on public lands or anywhere. Just in case you didn't know, now you know. The next town that I will be talking about is Cobre. And I just put it in the chat for you all. So Cobre was primarily an endpoint station on the Nevada Northern Railway. So this rail line was constructed for Nevada Consolidated Copper, and its purpose was moving copper from copper mines at Ruth near Ely. And Cobre was situated in a way where the Nevada Northern Railway was taking copper from south to north, and then it tied in to the Southern Pacific. And so it was just a very efficient way to move this copper east along that east-west line of the Southern Pacific. Cobre was named for the Spanish word for copper, unsurprisingly. It was at its peak between 1905 and 1910. There was a hotel, a post office, a few saloons, and a mercantile. In addition to being a connection point to the Nevada Northern for copper, there was lead mining about 10 miles to the west of Cobre in 6 Mile Canyon. This lead mining didn't last very long. Even though trains were still coming through with copper from Ely, passenger and freight traffic started to decline, and the population of Cobre never reached above 60. But it was still in use as a depot for passenger and freight traffic up until the 1930s, I believe. So something interesting that railroad companies did that ties in with this discussion of Cobre and also the next town I'm going to talk about. They're very strategic about rights of way. So what I mean by this is they built often railroad grades with no track to hold key spots on the land in order to lay claim to that area. So, for example, the Union Pacific had disconnected grade segments all over eastern Elko County. So related to this discussion on discontinuous grades, another rail line had actually built a discontinuous segment of grade across the valley that the Nevada Northern had to pass to get from Ely to Cobre. So that meant that, and that was the Western Pacific. So that meant that the Western Pacific ended up controlling the interchange for the Nevada Northern in the middle of the Goshute Valley at Shafter. And so the Nevada Northern had to negotiate with Western Pacific for their copper line. And so Shafter is the that siding that controlled the interchange in the Goshute Valley. Eventually, by the turn of the last century, like I think about 1907, the Western Pacific did end up finishing that discontinuous grade. So eventually they had a line that went from Salt Lake City all the way to San Francisco. So I'm coming up on my conclusion. So, you know, from talking about these rural railroad towns and industries, you can just really see how influential the Transcontinental Railroad was to this area. And I think looking at these small railroad towns allows us to paint that bigger picture of how the landscape of the Wellsfield office was so influenced by the railroad. In all these different industries, but also by the railroad companies themselves. So by the 1880s, actually, the railroad was America's largest employer. We also see a lot of ingenuity to keep these small towns alive when one industry fails. For example, with the case of Moore being established for track laborers, the woodcutters. Once that track was finished, Moore was served as a telegraph station. And there's a lot of innovation in railroad technology that we can observe in this time in history. And this was fueled by the need for the railroads to be financially efficient. So a trend that we observe over and over again is that the railroads were always trying to reduce distance of track and decrease grade so that they could use less water and fuel to keep operation costs down. For example, Promontory Summit had really steep grades. So in 1904, the Southern Pacific Railroad built a causeway across the Great Salt Lake that would reduce distances of track and decrease the grade. And this was a huge feat of engineering. So if you just Google Great Salt Lake Causeway, you'll see it. It was a 12-mile trestle built on fir pilings that were driven into the lake bottom. And then they put redwood and gravel on top of that. And the original trestle was actually in operation until 1959. So the story about the railroad that you can get from this area is really rich. And I've just chosen a few historic sites to help paint this bigger picture. And I really encourage you to get involved with your local site stewardship program if you live near public lands. And if you're in Elko County, definitely look for updates once I add those historic railroad sites to the program. So with that,
we do have a question.
yeah.
So what do you know about, or what do you know about the rail line to Metropolis?
Oh, yeah. I actually don't, I haven't done a lot of research into that rail line, so I can't speak to that right now, but I'm definitely going to put that on my list to look up. Does anyone else on the call know about the rail line to Metropolis? Are there any other questions?
Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank everybody for coming and enjoying this and staying with us despite our technical difficulties.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes. And there's already one person who's saying thanks, Andrea. So we really appreciate you guys coming and joining us, and hopefully we will see you again next week. Or not next week. I keep saying that, but it's next month on the 27th.